Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is C.B. Robertson. This is episode 59, and I'll try to keep it short today because this isn't a particularly long subject. I'm not covering another philosopher or interviewing a guest. I was inspired. I was listening to William Kirk from Washington Gun Law and talking about some updates on legal matters going on in the United States. And it occurred to me, none of the arguments being proffered for gun control measures, red flag laws, or whatever the case, are new. None of them are new, and none of the for all of the changes and developments in technology, nothing has fundamentally changed in this conversation, at least at the fundamentals. Obviously, we have changes in law, we have changes in the nature of the weapons themselves in some ways, not in their function. And I just thought it would be useful and perhaps interesting to some people to give three prominent examples from history of what people have had to say on this subject. Now, the usual arguments for restricting access to guns, for banning certain kinds of guns entirely, or even all guns in some cases, has been things like crime, self-harm, suicide. We can reduce that. What about people committing murder? What about mental health issues? And it is important to emphasize again and again, this is only one side of an equation that has another concern on the other side, which is of course, the intentions and benevolence of the rulers. And so the three sources I want to draw from, they're fairly obscure. You probably never heard of them before, but I'll bring them to your attention anyways, are Homer, Plato, and Machiavelli. So to begin with, I think the most obvious one is Homer, because some people will actually unironically use this line, not knowing the context. They'll say the blade itself incites to deeds of violence. The blade itself is its own kind of quotable line, and I think it should be a quotable line. It's a very quotable line, and it should be a kind of placeholder stand-in for this argument that we see in the Odyssey. And I'll read the actual quote here. This is in book 19 of the Odyssey. And for those of you who don't know, Homer is writing this in about 8th or 9th century BC. So not recent. Funny how the same arguments come up, though. The context here is Odysseus has come back and is conspiring with his son Telemachus what to do about the suitors. And so book 19 essentially opens with this line. I'm going to cut out a middle section where they talk about smoke damaging the weapons because no one cares. He says, Telemachus, we must have the weapons stored away inside the high chamber, and when the suitors miss them and ask you about them, answer and beguile them with soft words, saying, some divinity put into my head this great thought, that with wine and you might stand up and fight and wound each other, and spoil the feast and the courting, since iron all of itself works on a man and attracts him. End quote. Now, this idea that the very presence of weapons, it inspires men to use them on each other. Oh, the weapon! I have this feeling of power, and now I want to go shoot someone. Now I want to go injure someone. So far as I'm aware, it comes from the Odyssey, or at least it was first written down in the Odyssey. Again, 2,800 years ago. But in this context, that reasoning is being used as a cover to disarm the suitors. And after the suitors have been disarmed, Telemachus and Odysseus butcher them. They just kill them. 108 unarmed men killed by two men who are armed. And so the purpose of that argument, the argument was not offered sincerely, was not advanced sincerely, even in its first form, which is, I think, important context to remember, to bear in mind whenever people make arguments of this kind. There is a risk of a kind of genetic fallacy here. The origin doesn't necessarily, convey the intent of a modified version of the argument in the moment, but that is its origin, and a lot of this is just rhetoric, anyways, on both sides. So, carrying on, I just wanted people to be aware of this Homer origin. So moving on to Plato. Now, I have been thinking about Homer for quite some time, generally, but as it pertains to disarmament, in particular in that line. I think I've made some posts about it somewhere. Another one, and Machiavelli has some very explicit and direct things to say about disarmament, which I will go over momentarily. But a new one I hadn't thought of until just a few minutes ago, and decided to sit down and do this, was Plato. And I had always thought of Plato. I'm a big fan of Strauss in terms of understanding Plato, or attempting to understand Plato. I am not one of these people who thinks the Republic is a literal prescription of how politics should be done. I think that's silly. I did a whole podcast on the Republic separately. However, the characters in Plato's Republic, Socrates, do lay out a kind of argument for totalitarianism. And it's not to say the text in itself is arguing for that, but it's taking a look at this argument. And this is traditionally held to begin around somewhere between book 2 and book 3. That's when they start talking about the just city. But perhaps the groundwork is laid in the introduction, where they're first trying to decide what justice even is. Socrates has been questioning Cephalus, an old man whose house they're visiting. He's been abducted to join this party. But Cephalus had to go off and do some sacrifices, and so other men variously inherit the argument that was begun. And so Socrates says to Polemarchus, who is the son of Cephalus, "Tell me, then, O thou heir of the argument, what did Simonides say?" Simonides is a sophist, another wise man who's teaching young men things in order to make arguments. "What did Simonides say, and according to you truly say, about justice?" Polemarchus: "He said that the repayment of a debt is just, and in saying so he appears to me to be right." Socrates: "I should be sorry to doubt the word of such a wise and inspired man, but his meaning, though probably clear to you, is the reverse of clear to me. For he certainly does not mean, as we were now saying, that I ought to return a deposit of arms, or of anything else, to one who asks for it, when he is not in his right senses. And yet a deposit cannot be denied to be a debt." Polemarchus: "True." Socrates: "Then what the person who asks me is not in his right mind, I am by no means to make the return?" Polemarchus: "Certainly not." Socrates: "When Simonides said that the repayment of a debt was justice, he did not mean to include that case." Polemarchus: "Certainly not, for he thinks that a friend ought always to do good to a friend and never evil." End quote. And this is in book 1. This is in the very opening. This is sort of the introduction. This is before Thrasymachus has even entered the scene. So we already have the groundwork laid for specifically, and this is almost one of the first disputes in the entire book, for not returning weapons to people who might not be in their right mind. Have we heard that argument in contemporary politics? I think we have quite a bit. I think that is the entire justifications for the growing number of red flag laws that we see. It's the exact same idea. And where does this take us in the Republic? Well, it takes us to the place that Karl Popper and Jonathan Rauch call the essence of the totalitarian mindset. It takes us to this crazy fusion of communism and fascism that is run by lying to the public, noble lies they're called, by controlling everybody's thoughts through with a campaign of incredibly thorough censorship of secret murders that the public's not allowed to know about, and basically just complete and thorough totalitarianism, such that people, the occupants of this republic, have no freedom whatsoever. That's the only way to ensure justice in such a society that is governed in this manner. And I think it's obvious from the tone that this question about what about returning weapons to someone who you think is not in their right mind is a sort of foreshadowing of the nature and essence of the just city that Plato is building up. And I think it is interesting that and perhaps symbolic, that weapons is that first item, is the introductory first step towards this just city that they wind up constructing. So that's Plato, the Republic, who I've done an entire podcast on Plato and on the Republic specifically. I recommend you go and listen to that if you have not read it. It's a fantastic work in its own right. But finally, and most on the nose, I'll mention Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli is essentially the inventor of political science, as is practiced today. He's not concerned with what a good city looks like. He is concerned with how does a leader acquire and maintain power. Just pure power. And the Prince is essentially his advice on how to do this. And it's not all good advice. A lot of it is, unfortunately, good advice, functional. But it's the approach that he pioneered. Like Descartes. Not everyone takes Descartes' ideas necessarily seriously anymore, but his method of thorough, complete doubt of everything. The same idea with the Prince. And I think most politicians today would be considered Machiavellians in this understanding of the term. And in The Prince, in the beginning of chapter 20, he says, quote, "There never was a new prince who has disarmed his subjects. Rather, when he has found them disarmed, he has always armed them, because by arming them, those arms become yours. Those men who were distrusted become faithful, and those who were faithful are kept so, and your subjects become your adherents. And whereas all subjects cannot be armed, yet when those whom you do arm are benefited, the others can be handled more freely. And this difference in their treatment, which they quite understand, makes the former your dependents, and the latter, considering it to be necessary that those who have the most danger and service should have the most reward, excuse you. But when you disarm them, you at once offend them by showing that you distrust them, either for cowardice or for want of loyalty, and either of these opinions breeds hatred against you. And because you cannot remain unarmed, it follows that you turn to mercenaries, which are of the character already shown. Even if they should be good, they would not be sufficient to defend you against powerful enemies and distrusted subjects. Therefore, as I have said, a new prince in a new principality has always distributed arms. Histories are full of examples." And that's where I think a lot of pro-2A people would be tempted to stop with the quote. But I think it is valuable to read a few extra sentences here, because it, I think, brings us full circle with Plato and with Homer to a common denominator on the other side of the equation of the disarmament question. Machiavelli continues, "But when a prince acquires a new state, which he adds as a province to his old one, then it is necessary to disarm the men of that state, except those who have been his adherents in acquiring it, and these again, with time and opportunity, should be rendered soft and effeminate, and matters should be managed in such a way that all the armed men in the state shall be your own soldiers who are in your old state or living near you." End quote. So, the purpose, of course, in Machiavelli is entirely about power. And it's interesting to see how, when he's speaking to a prince of his own people, the people that he actually represents and who are his constituency, arming them is the only reasonable method. It's the only reasonable thing to do in all cases. It's, their own safety is like not even a political concern, you know. And with, but the motivation for disarmament only makes sense when it is not your people, when you have acquired a new state and the people and they are not your people, essentially. Likewise with Plato, the people, you know, he's describing the people who are not in their right mind, which is already a dangerous precedent and justification, because it dovetails so nicely into that famous C.S. Lewis quote about how you know, the worst of all tyrannies is the tyranny of the well-intentioned, because they are compelled to tyrannize out of their own conscience, as opposed to the bloodthirsty tyrant who might be satiated after a certain amount of sadism. And he says that it's particularly intolerable to be tyrannized for your own good, because it puts you on a level with imbeciles and animals. And I think that is not just the necessary a necessary belief to justify the kind of disarmament that Socrates is alluding to in the Republic, but it leads exactly into the kind of totalitarian just city that is later built on the assumption that these people are predictably irrational, as Dan Ariely might say. They don't know what's best for themselves, so we have to arrange things for them. As soon as you say, I think this person is not in their right mind, so I'm not going to give them their weapons back, well, suddenly what qualifies as being in your right mind, possibly nobody's in the right mind. Perhaps especially those people who are taken over by the demon of the lust for power, but it's a separate subject. And of course, finally, you know, the most blunt and the most direct depiction of the desire for disarmament is with Homer. I mean, where disarmament is just a direct antecedent to and preparation for a massacre, for some kind of brutal authoritarian assertion of power over the people, whether that's killing them all as Odysseus and Telemachus did, or something equally assertive, if not quite as lethal, is sort of irrelevant in the question of politics. And so the common denominator, while the individual justifications offered for disarmament are different, whether it's insanity or crime or murder or protecting people from themselves, the justifications on one side of the equation continue to vary. But throughout all of human history, the justification on the other side of that equation, on the side of the people putting out policy, it is disguised explicitly in the Odyssey and in Plato's Republic. It is disguised as protecting individuals from themselves. You know, for he thinks that a friend ought always to do good to a friend and never evil. That's why we disarm you, Simonides. It's disguised as that, but the intention is, absolute control. It is a blunt assertion of power, if not worse. And that is even true in a very coy, playful way with Plato's Republic, with the reductio ad absurdum that lies at the end of the just city that they build upon this line of thought that begins with the humble desire to protect your friend from himself. So there are points worth dwelling upon, and I encourage people to go and read these texts directly from the source, because they are worth reading in their own right, and for reasons far beyond, contemporary utility in politics. That is a peripheral side perk and benefit from having this knowledge. But even as a peripheral side perk, I think it is valuable and might be useful to people who are either trying to explore this subject not just within the narrow scope of our own parochial little time period that oscillates up and down in what kinds of factors are working their way into our decision-making process, but taking a step back and thinking less parochially in terms of time and thinking on the broader scale of our whole human experience. What have been the more or less universal truths of human nature that go into these sorts of decisions at the political level? And I think if you do that, the patterns become a little bit more clear, and the intentions and knowledge, for that matter, of the people who are advocating, disarmament by degree today also become a little bit more clear. So, thanks for listening, and take care.